going to open up for questions, and I don't want to be too strict on time. How long is lunch? How long should lunch be?
45 minutes.
45 minutes.
So go.
Okay.
If people are like willing, it's up to the audience. But if people are like willing, go
the hands that are out here are intimidating. That's fine. What I will do is that I will allow just one round of hands, and then we'll have responses. Let's aim to finish up by 1:45, and then have lunch from 1:45 until 3:30.
So 2:30.
Until 2:30, sorry. Until 2:30. Okay. I'll start with on this side because there's only 2 hands. The first hand there, just please shout 1, 2. Then at the back, the gentleman in the white shirt will be 3, then 4, then 5, yes, then 6, 7 at the corner, 8, 9, 10. Done. Just be brief. If you like give a preamble, I'm gonna cut you. Don't be like me, please.
Actually, my question is rather, my comment is to me, actually, because you referred quite a bit to the ILO, and there are 2 things that I'd like to just place it on record to be on the correct side. You tried saying that ILO is recommending 40 to, as far as the level of non-wages is concerned, 40 to 50% of the average wages. And I'd like to just say that it's not a recommendation. What we have said in our reports and also in our publications is very clearly is that in OECD countries, what we observe is that the level at which the minimum wage is set is about 40 to 60% of the median wages. We also do observe that there are countries where the minimum wage is being set at 40% of the average wage. So I think this is very important for you to take into consideration. The second thing is with regard to what you said about political decision versus technical decision. And yes, I think what we'd like to say here very clearly is that, we do want countries to do the technical work, to take the technical assistance, to base the level of their wages based on empirical evidence. But we do finally know that sometimes not all of this work is really taken up when the decision is made, and it does become very politicized and political. So I think it's the issue of much more rephrasing how you go about it.
Thank you.
I think everybody has said minimum wage is a political decision. My question is on the labor level at that level. I just want to know as to how is our friend, the government, taking that proposal? Are they agreeing with it, or are they putting their head on the sand and then thinking that it will go away? I just want to check on that, the attitude of government.
Thank you.
I think that there's a voice of the insourcing movement. There's a wave in the country to insource workers, universities, public institutions, etc. And I am calling for a link that should be developed between the debate around the minimum wage and the idea of insourcing externalized workers. The second one is, I find this a debate that happened at Network notoriously isolating, especially the base of workers, right? We have just no mobilization, no campaigning, and in fact, just ensuring that employers, the agenda of employers is doing there. I hope that the concession around minimum wage doesn't come with a concession for employers for a ban of those strikes. A comment for me would be
Thank you.
Concession for?
Can I ask that people introduce themselves?
Can you just repeat the last one? Concession for?
Say concession.
Wage in exchange for limiting strikes.
Yeah.
Or a ban on strikes.
No, there's some. You're after him.
It's my congress. Just following from my.
Please introduce yourself. Sorry to the first three.
The Benchmarks Foundation work with mining communities, and it's one of the exclusions because these are very, very poor communities living around pools of wealth. So I think when we talk about this discussion, they often get excluded, and I think we're not to talk about those excluded. We have a problem because the other day we heard on the radio that people who did not get formal employment started forcing those in formal employment not to go to work so they could get a job as well. So this whole connection is something worthwhile. But my point was, Neil, when we spoke earlier, I think we must collectively admit a failure of the labor movement across federations to have kept up struggles for a living wage. In 1990, when the ANC came to put together a platform for the democratic dispensation, they concluded in the Conference for Democratic Future a number of issues on banning of political parties, etc., etc. One of the demands was a living wage for all, which the unions insisted upon. And as I think was alluded to earlier, this is not only a legislative process. The American unions, however bad they may be, organized around fast foods, etc., etc. There are different ways to obtain this, and I think we must have some critical reflection on how the unions were the priorities of the labor movement for the last 20 years.
Thank you. We're doing well so far with the questions and time.
It's Rob Rees from Naledi. Look, I think it's interesting today. There's much more reflection that the level is a political decision, which was acknowledged yesterday by the Director General, which is a challenge to the economists who are constructing these models without an input of social struggle. So that doesn't exist in Iran, actually. So that's a critique of the left and the right modeling, that there's no struggle. I mean, the biggest increases that we've seen, said 1973 strikes, massive quick increase, or the insourcing, all emerged out of struggle. So I don't think we should consider Marikana as a case of no central bargaining. There wouldn't be Marikana. I think it's more honest to reflect that we have a problem in our organizations of rank and file control, more broadly, because we also have a case of central bargaining where the rank and file can't control their leaders who conclude agreements, which I think has been expressed before in relation to NEDLAC. So can we have a comment where, because one of the assessments of sectoral central bargaining is the minimum becomes the maximum, even in the most organized sectors, take metal. The worst thing employers want is another bite of the cherry outside the central bargain on the ground. Just last comment, I think we need much greater transparency of NEDLAC. We cannot have this continued secret negotiations. It's just nonsense, whether it's provident funds or the national minimum wage. We need, if it's to be, NEDLAC is to assist our participation, we have to have information up front, and not just through other sources which we may not get.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilman then after
This question is for Neil. In particular, if you could give more detailed description of why you used the QES over the QLFS to set the mean benchmark. The QES, as we know, takes employer surveys of what they report they pay workers, and the QLFS reports directly from workers what they make. And you cited the reason you used the QES as that there's massive underreporting in QLFS. However, if you're going to make that claim that there's underreporting within the QES and that's why you're taking this benchmark, you also have to fully back up the claim that the poverty levels that have been statistically calculated are not as bad as they are. So I think there's a picking and choosing in which level you want to go at, but maybe you need to be more careful, and I would like a more in-depth explanation.
And your name, comrade? Your name?
Oh, Ben.
Ben. Okay. Quickly, Rob.
My name is Kira. Neil. We need to incorporate my question to his question to the gentleman here.
So they asked you a question.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is that he asked to incorporate one question, which I'm going to ask right now, into their questions. But I want to be very specific on this one, that I want to talk about the tax relief.
What?
The tax relief. And the tax relief specifically for companies that are, or maybe for the companies which are expected to implement this minimum wage, additional minimum wage. I feel it will be a bit unfair for the government or whoever to side and abdicate this responsibility of minimum wage to business without considering the fact that government will take the lead. All what I'm saying, or the bottom line, is that if you want to enforce compliance, you have to be reciprocal at some stage. Say, those companies that have complied with the minimum wage implementation, at least they must get some sort of tax relief somewhere. I'm not saying companies must not pay tax, but there should be a percentage that they also benefit. If you look at it in a way that we are only trying to make the low paid, or maybe the low paid wages. Come again?
Finish up.
Oh, okay, I'll finish up.
Please.
If you look at it in the sense that people who are low paid should survive without or equalize, because at the end of the day, this money should come to someone. The government, by relieving companies with tax, does not relieve this money.
Okay. Thanks. Someone's advocated that big business should not be taxed. Quickly.
Yeah, it's David, CTC. So yeah, remember the government is came from the when the economic further thing like that, the industrialization level, the fourth industrial revolution. So yeah, so my concern was that if government is also adamant to push for industrialization, is he also concerned about those vulnerable sectors which are more focusing on the industrialization, like Ghana and the so and the legal impedance to the wage structure will be the concern. Yeah, national is it hate speech when I reimagine to myself national majority wage. Since I understand from the background of this man's work, it sounds like parent of this man's work. Okay. So yeah, and the other issue would be that since we invited our counterparts, the Germans, the Malaysians, etc., which we also although that we share differences, like inequalities, we share different histories, etc. and stuff. So our recommendation from the commission was to compare the South African culture as the national majority wage. To divide the budget this much.
The last time.
Okay, two questions. One is from Neil. Can you give us, please, an example of unexpected area of common ground in the negotiation? We've heard a lot about where there is none. And then a question to Debbie. I'm really happy as a lawyer here because I don't understand the process. What, or how long, can you give us an estimate, how long or how short would it be to implement minimum wage if a figure could be agreed? So assuming we have a figure today, when would it be?
The last time was to you.
Yes, my name is still Jeremy Seekings. I'm not going to respond, I don't want to respond to Neil Coleman, particularly because I published criticisms of Neil Coleman's position, the CSSR working paper from last year out on the ground up. You're welcome to go and look at it. But I think it's important to point out one thing, that Neil's a big fan of Brazil. I'm a big fan of the Brazilian experience. Brazil has raised its minimum wage, national minimum wage, and
with positive effects on poverty and inequality. What is the value of the minimum wage in Brazil in South African rand in terms of purchasing power? 2,500. The value of the Brazilian national minimum wage in terms of purchasing power is the figure that Neil tells us is disgustingly little. Right? Now, this is bizarre. In fact, the national minimum wage in Brazil has got lower purchasing power than the minimum wage for farm workers in South Africa today. Right? So let's put this in perspective. These are very similar economies in many respects. You know, the Brazilian model is one we should take very seriously, and the Brazilian lesson is 2,500 rand a month. It should be taken very seriously. Now, Neil also tells us that this would affect very few workers. But yesterday, Arden Singh told us that a minimum wage of 2,500 would affect 30% of workers. 30% is Arden wrong. 30% of workers is a lot of very low-wage workers. If we're going to improve the wages of the bottom 30% of workers, we're going to have a huge effect on poverty and inequality. I don't know how you can just dismiss that out of hand. So, but this is important because when we think about the level, we really need to be critical. Now, my main question is for Debbie, actually. Debbie, I'll ask a question. I'm completely puzzled as to why you think the experience of London sheds light on minimum wages. Right? You're saying that, you quite rightly say that it's disgusting that the chief executive of London gets 17 million when the workers get 10,000 rand a month or whatever it is now. And you're quite right. But even if we accepted Cosatu's proposal of a national minimum of 6,000 rand, which is incidentally about 200% of the median wage.
Where was it? Did you say 6,000?
6,000. Well, let's say 4,500, right?
Let's get to the question.
Right.
Let's get to the question.
A national minimum wage of 4,500 rand a month will make no difference to the wage inequality in Longmin.
Excellent.
Right? Now, the question, why are you using a Longmin experience to justify the national minimum wage, rather than thinking about the employers and the employees who are really going to be affected? Because the employers are the employers who are paying less than 2,500 or less than 5,000. It's not Charlie Griffiths, CEO.
Now we get to the question. That's the question.
Taxi owners, spaza shops, domestic worker employers, small farmers. It's not Longmin.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes for responses.
Can I just respond to the last question and then I'll hand over to Neil? I specifically said I'm not giving this example in the context of national minimum wages. My presentation is about wage structures in total. When I showed the 12,500 poster, I said that is high compared to what's being proposed at 4.5. This is not about national minimum wage. This is about a wage structure. So I wasn't talking about that in the context of national wage. That's one tool. National minimum wages are one tool, but what I was using Americana to point out is the extent to which wage structures are problematic and not just the national minimum wage or low wages. I was saying 12.5 is very generous compared to what's being debated here. Neil.
I'm going to stand up because just so that you can hear me. Apologies to my panel members. It seems like nearly all the questions were focused at me, but I've encouraged them to speak about the secrecy in NEDLAC and some other issues, so maybe they'll sort of add on. In relation to Umarani's point, if we gave the impression that we were saying that the ILO is recommending 40 to 50%, that wasn't intentional. What we mean to say, and what is the case, is that the OECD and the ILO have documented the fact that most of the national minimum wages internationally cluster around that level of 40 to 50%. On the question of political decisions being taken, it's not to say that, our position in NEDLAC has always been that the discussions must be evidence-based. We need the evidence there. But actually the very interesting thing is that some parties don't want to hear the evidence. And we've seen it at the symposium, actually, that business is boycotting the symposium and government has refused to participate in the panels. So we've experienced this in NEDLAC. Thanks. We've experienced this in NEDLAC over the last 6 to 9 months. So I think that's part of the politics, actually, as to which evidence you prepare and which evidence you prepare to engage with. But we have found, as negotiators, and I'm saying this genuinely, that the evidence that has been brought to bear by organizations like the ILO, by institutions like the institution that's convened this seminar and others, has been extremely useful in helping us to understand some of the options, the policy options. But at the end of the day, it's the parties that are negotiating and government ultimately that needs to make a political decision about what policy options it takes forward. And that is really the point that I was making. There are a few questions about how government has responded to the proposals that Labour, the three federations and the community constituency have made. I've got to be careful a little bit because it relates to the point that Rob Rees made, is that we've been hamstrung by the fact that a number of the discussions that have been taken place have been either behind closed doors and not communicated, or have been specifically marked as confidential. So I'm going to make a general comment, and I'll explain why the confidentiality part. It relates to a question that someone asked me about unexpected gains. We are extremely disappointed by the stance that government has taken in these negotiations. In my talk, which will be on the website, I came to outline the agreements that were reached in June 2015, which outline basically the definition of a national minimum wage and what the basic architecture of the national minimum wage would be. The Deputy President announced this agreement at the International Labour Symposium, which took place in June last year. We have not made any significant progress since then. There are two reasons that we've made no significant progress. One is because of the intransigence of business, the total intransigence of business, their refusal even to engage, as I said, with the evidence, including to entertain presentations by this very important research initiative. But secondly, their refusal to engage on discussions around the level of the national minimum wage, and ultimately the level is everything, obviously, and issues relating to the level. Are we surprised by that? We're not really surprised by that. Right from the beginning of the negotiations in January, February last year, business made it clear that they were being dragged kicking and screaming into the negotiations. They resisted the notion of a national minimum wage and tried to maintain that we need to stick with the sectoral minimum wages for reasons that are fairly obvious, because the current situation is very comfortable. You know, the status quo is very healthy for business. They think. Actually, it's extremely unhealthy, but that's another discussion that we can have. So we haven't been surprised by all the resistance tactics, etc., etc. Our international allies have told us that business has done exactly the same around the world. In fact, when we went to Germany, it was very funny because the national minimum wage had already been introduced, and the employers were still grumbling about it as if it had never been introduced and feeding the false information about the terrible consequences it was going to have, etc. I think that's the reality of power relations in society. What's been a huge disappointment to us is the lack of leadership that government has shown in this situation. And I haven't spoken out publicly, we haven't spoken out publicly as Labour, because we've done everything to give this process a chance. But I think the point has been arrived at now, where we owe it to the people of this country and the constituencies who have the greatest interest in terms of benefiting from that, to be honest with them and to be open with them. And I think the point that Rob Rees raises about the unacceptable level of secrecy in the NEDLAC negotiations, we have raised, someone here from community has raised repeatedly. And we're not pointing a finger at the communications people of NEDLAC who are here. It's a political decision that's been taken to keep these negotiations behind closed doors. And I think that needs to change. On the insourcing movement, I need to hurry up. On the insourcing movement, the lack of mobilization by NEDLAC, I've agreed with that. The concession. This was the first issue that business tabled in the negotiations at the beginning of last year. They said we want the labor relations discussions, the discussion about strikes, and we want the national minimum wage discussions to be held in one task team. And we refused to do that. And the reason we refused to do that is we became aware that they wanted to trade off agreement on a national minimum wage for concessions around the right to strike, etc., etc. We refused to do that. We put it into 2 task teams. So certainly at this point, there's no agreement to trade off the national minimum wage in relation to other labor relations issues. In fact, the labor movement supported by community has pushed hard for other advances in relation to collective bargaining. Hassan's point about the failure of the trade union movement to keep up the struggles for the living wage is absolutely correct. And that's precisely why we had to embark on the strategy of campaigning for a national minimum wage. Not that that's abandoning the living wage struggle, but it's another leg in that struggle. I think I've responded to Rob Rees's questions. Avoiding the minimum becoming the maximum is precisely the issue. That's the role that the trade union movement has to play in complementing the national minimum wage. The secrecy issue I've answered. Ben Jordan's question about QES versus QLFS, it's a technical economist question, but it's a very important one. We and the research initiative have accepted that we use the quarterly labor force survey because this is a survey that all the economists rely on. However, we are concerned with certain weaknesses, including the underreporting issue. We accept that the quarterly employment survey, which is a survey of employers and only covers employers over a certain size and only employers in the formal non-agricultural sector, we accept that it's got certain limitations. But do we therefore write off the QES as of absolutely no value? Are we not allowed to refer to the fact that average wages in the QES, the latest QES, was something like 16,000 Rand a month? Does that tell us nothing about the economy? No. We're not going to be stampeded into refusing to refer to the QES, but we do understand that the QLFS must be the major reference point in relation to the statistics. I didn't get his point about poverty levels. I mean, Saldru has done a very detailed analysis of those poverty levels. Stats SA has rebased their poverty levels, accepting that they were too low. So the economists must sort out their engagements around this. But we also think communities need to engage with, do they really believe that these minimum living levels are adequate? On the question of tax relief, I think it defeats the object if companies are told you must pay a minimum wage, but we're going to pay it back to you in tax. Because all that means basically is in the end that we are paying for what is an absolute imperative in terms of social justice, in terms of equity, in terms of all the issues that we're talking about. But we have drawn on the international experience to say in Brazil, they've used very interesting measures, such as what's called the simplices, the simplification of the tax system in Brazil, which have given incentives to small business to cooperate with labor legislation, and have in fact brought a lot of them into the tax net and the labor law net who weren't there before, by giving them access to lower interest rates, access to credit. On the World Economic Forum, is government serious about industrialization? I hope so. An example of unexpected area of common ground, that's a very interesting question. There have actually been examples, but the question is where those will go. The 2 key examples actually are this notion of a medium-term strategy. Business, government, our community and ourselves have agreed that we need to have a medium-term strategy and that we could give targets to the competent authority to achieve certain goals within particular time periods. Obviously, the question is, what are those targets? And that's where the real discussion would be. The other one is that a business has agreed that the question of the average, of the ratio of the national minimum wage to the average wage should be considered in relation to this particular question. On Jeremy Seeking's point, I'm not going to get into a... Yeah, he's written articles, half of which are taken up with critiques of things that I've written, which is very flattering. But for me, the question is not whether the Brazilian national minimum wage is 2,500 or 3,600 or what it is in terms of purchasing power parity, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the issue. The issue is it rose from the level that it was by well over 100% in real terms. That means that the position of those workers has significantly improved over that period. That means employers have had to adjust to those realities, and this is the experience that we need to draw on. The fact that 2,500 would affect 30% of workers in South Africa just shows what a scandal the level of poverty wages is in this country. And the fact that you want us to accept that we are happy to perpetuate that wage structure because it affects 30% or 40% or 60% of the workers is really not, it's really not going to wash. What we have done is in looking at the various levels, and when Asghar Adalzadeh did his modeling and when Gilad and Arden did their modeling, we've seen what the number of workers who are going to be affected by various proposals are. We're not blind to that. It's not like the trade unions don't care about the impact on employment. We care far more about the impacts on employment than certainly business does. And so that is how we came to the conclusion that because of the very low wages in agriculture and domestic work, a more sensible approach was to go for a tiered system and to bring agricultural and domestic workers into it over time. I'm sorry to go on for so long, but I thought it was important to answer those questions. Thanks.